Good morning. I'm Tony Momberger with the Redlands Daily Facts, doing another installment of our video interview series for the 125th anniversary of our city. Today I'm sitting at what used to be the House of Neighborly Service, is now Family Services Association, with Antonio Vazquez, who has gone back to his father's name, but originally was grew up here in Redlands as Robert Gonzalez, if anybody gets confused. Anyway, Antonio, thank you for joining us
today.
For having me. I've done several of these interviews so far, and we've talked an awful lot about the impact that people have had on this community, and they've pretty much all been white people. There's a very large Mexican demographic here in Redlands. Why don't I have people talking about the impact and the history of Mexicans in Redlands?
Well, like many of the Mexican communities throughout the Inland Empire, the communities tended to, although they were majority in population most of the time, because being saddled with the idea of being a minority, interests were often less served politically, culturally, and oftentimes what would happen is within the community, the history would be preserved by individuals. But collectively, it's an interesting thing in Southern California. Southern Californians have a passion for the mission heritage, and it seems to stop at that. And certainly at the time we're talking about the history of Redlands kind of being constructed in the early part of the 20th century, being developed, I guess you would say. That was a big passion for people, but their interest in Mexican culture more or less stopped at that period. And the fascination of it, which became revived in the 20s and 30s artistically, which is one of the reasons this building is even here, did not transmit itself to history. History is very much filled with politics. No matter how you try to parse through it, it is very political. And ultimately, they say that history is written by the winners. It's certainly written by those who have the money to write it.
So Mexican history in Redlands was not recorded. Bottom line, it doesn't exist.
It didn't.
It didn't exist.
It didn't exist at all.
Okay. How do you know this?
As I was leaving graduate school in the early 1990s, Larry Burgess was a professor of mine, and I took classes in archival management, and I realized one of the importance of archives to historians is really important. And Larry had urged me on several occasions. He knew where I came from. He knew that my family was from North Redlands, had a long history here, and even I didn't know really the depth and scope of my family history. But I refused several times. I told him I didn't want to do these histories. And the main reason why was because the focus was, at that time, was either what was wrong in a community, and that's why we're going to examine your history, or a specific thing like agriculture. Mm-hmm. And Larry wanted me to look into citrus labor. I said, well, that will just perpetuate a stereotype for me. So I dug through their archives. Larry asked me to take a look. I took a look. Spent about a month in there. And the joke was on me, and we all know how Larry loves to joke in Redlands. They had nothing. There was literally nothing.
There was nothing in the archives.
Oh yeah, so I spent a month. A professionally trained history student, or historian at that point, came out looking for materials, and what I found was a series of interviews that had been conducted in the 80s, where
1980s?
1980s, and it was with growers and people who had done the social things in town, socialites in town, and it was called Citrus and Service, I believe it was called. And most of these things were riddled with, what we typically, consider not nice things to say about Mexican people throughout the whole thing. And that was the only reference, was negative, or it was very paternalistic. They were our Mexicans, and we took good care of our Mexicans, things like that. Mm-hmm. And when I came out, I was about 28 years old, I was 27, and I was just angry. I was hurt, really. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Redlands, and Redlands meant a lot to me in terms of I had a family history that extended back almost 100 years. And again, even though I wasn't aware of it, but something in me, when I saw that, something in me just said, I have to do this, but I have to do it in a way that I think will be, make it more, to use the term, throw it inclusive, make it more inclusive. And I didn't just want to talk to people about their experiences in the groves. I wanted to find out what their life as human beings in a place like Redlands was like.
Yes.
And that really is what led me into that now 20-year exploration of those themes.
So you have studied now and recorded the stories of the Mexican people and their experience in this community and their impact on this community over the past 125 years.
Well, we've tried. We've done a lot of work. In the 90s, we did the Redlands Oral History Project, which is, I believe, about 40 hours of tape that has, and many of them are transcribed in Smiley, but they need to be redone. That has about all this tape and information from a variety of people and from all across town. So really, yeah, we have a really neat, it certainly isn't everybody, because not everybody wanted to be interviewed. But a lot of people, from friends of my mom's, friends of my grandfather's, and people that were just interested. And then we started collecting photos, and that's where it really opened up. Because oftentimes, particularly in ethnic communities, photo collections aren't donated to libraries. They're not given that kind of priority. So it's usually up to one person in the family to hold on to those things. And when that person goes, stories associated with the photos, the identities of the people, and oftentimes the photos themselves just disappear. And one of the people that Rita Radliff was her name, Rita and her brother Lee had a neat little stash of photos, and they said, you need to start collecting pictures. So we did. And now, again, 20 years later, we have, and that's just the Redlands portion of it. We started doing other stuff later on, but we have close to 700 historic images archived.
Right on.
And it's an amazing opportunity that we were given over the years. So.
Last May, a year ago, you gave me a tour of Redlands from the Mexican history perspective, and we started at the Santa Fe train depot. Tell me why we started there.
A very common theme in the Mexican immigrant experience is railroad transport. People worked in the railroads. Entire villages were literally hired, families and all, in from Mexico and brought to the United States to work, which is unusual because in the Chinese story, males were brought and had to leave their families behind. In Mexico, the companies would literally just buy up an entire town's labor and bring them to America. And we have families that did that. So, and people worked along the railroad. The oranges were right on the railroad tracks. So pretty much social life of the community revolved around the area of the railroad track for both communities, for both the white and the Mexican community. So the Santa Fe station is a really important, it's not just a landmark in that physical bricks and mortar sense. It has a certain psychological and emotional connection. When I show pictures of the old station to people when it was the Pacific Electric, the elders get very, you see the reaction about what that time is like and how that time is now gone. But that's why I chose that place.
And when you stand there and you look onto Orange Street and up and down, you're seeing what these people saw when they arrived for the first time. This is their introduction, this is their first impression of Redlands. You talked about, as we walked down Orange Street, what used to be there and how they were the things that served the Mexican population of Redlands. Tell me some of the things that were there.
Well, we have to remember that the railroad tracks were also a dividing line. They demarcated where Redlands began and where Mexican Redlands began. And even though there were no signs, stay out, wrong, nothing like that, because people worked on both sides of town. But all of the services that Mexican Americans could use were located right near the railroad tracks, mostly around Stewart, 3rd Streets, that area. There were bakeries, there were bars, there were restaurants, there were barbers, and also a broad ethnic community, Jewish people, Japanese people, had the businesses. Now, during World War II, that shifted, and a lot of Mexican people became owners of businesses along there, due to the misfortune of the Japanese community, and because the Jewish community was not really welcome in Redlands either at that point in time, and there was a considerable mix between the Jewish population in Redlands and the Mexican community because of trade, and so that was there. It was really this whole area where we're at right now was a really busy, lively neighborhood and community. This was the center of the Colonial. It's where we're at.
Let's start right at the train station. If you look across the street, there's the Flamingo. And this is a bar that continues to run today. A lot of people call it the Dirty Bird, but the Mexicans called it something else.
It used to be, well, the original, I don't know if they were original, but one of the owners of it during the 40s was a German couple named Schulte, the last name Schulte, and the Mexican, it was one of the only places on that side of the tracks, actually, that Mexicans were allowed to go in, mainly because of Mitten, the Mitten Company, and those buildings, or those industrial buildings, were right there. And so I think the idea was, you can't keep a person out of a place to go have a drink and a bite to eat that's right next to their work.
Right.
And the rules were bent a lot in Redlands like that. And so anyway, but to answer the question, from what my father and others told me was that a lot of the newer Mexican immigrants could not pronounce the name Schulte, so they called it Shooties.
Shooties.
And you could go into Shooties and get a hot dog and a beer for 5 cents. And it also, I think, kind of really, places like that kind of paved the way for larger desegregation of the community later on.
Wow. And as you go, obviously north, because it was the south of the freeway, the train tracks was not Mexican Redlands. So as you go north, let's say on the left, there's Craig and Auto Parts now. Tell me what used to be there.
That building has served many purposes. And that's the beauty of Orange Street, is that if you even have a slight idea of the history of the community, that corridor is still very much intact, and even the buildings were made to look like the old buildings. And so that was a roller rink. And I heard many stories about they had Spanish night, and it was Wednesday nights, and it was the night that Mexican Americans could go and skate. And it was a very popular meeting place for kids, and they would have dances. And that building still, then I remember it was a social services place for a while, and then they've redone it and cleaned it up, and they did a great job. And that kind of, those kind of landmarks, there's that, and then across the street where the Coffee Bean and all those places are, that is an old hotel. It was built in probably 1913 or 1911, the Deeming Hotel. And the man who built it had a love for Native American culture. And he put the Native American symbol, the Nahuelin, the swastika, up on the building. And unfortunately, it's still covered up, because I think we could learn a lot. It's not, people made a mistake and it became a controversy in the 1980s. It was a reminder of Nazis, and it's actually a symbol of hope and of it's that everlasting community. It's a really beautiful symbol.
Yeah, we should slow down for those who don't know what we're talking about.
Sorry.
On that building on the front, on the face of it, you'll see a circular plate with a words on it. I think
it says Deeming Hotel in 1912.
Yeah,
it was built.
That was put there in the late 80s to cover up what appears to be a swastika. It's a mirror image, and it is not a swastika. It's an Indian symbol of peace. And when they redeveloped that area as part of the revitalization of downtown, it was controversial. Some people said that it even if it's not supposed to be a swastika, it appears to be and would be interpreted by some as the support of the Nazi actions. And so they covered it up, but it's under there still, and we have, I got a photo of it on my desk actually, because it's a symbol of peace. So I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay, because I kind of jump ahead of myself sometimes on these things. But yeah, that building is there, and so we have a couple of examples of structures and places right next to the tracks. Have been there for a long time. Even the small industrial buildings along Stewart that are now furniture shops, things. Those places have been functioning literally almost 100 years continuously as some kind of business, and there's a certain, I think, where the freeway changed a lot. Many of the things really stayed the same. This place is still here, for example.
Well, I'm going to get to that. Yeah. I'm going to slow you down.
Yeah, sure.
Where Band Board Shop is now, I think of as Kay's Cafe from my childhood. Before that, it was a barber shop where the Mexicans
could... It was a barber shop. Tal's Barber Shop.
Tal,
T-A-L.
T-A-L.
Tal Powell was his name.
How was he? A good barber, you know?
Man, he was one of these guys who would just shave the corner of your head. No offense, he was a really nice guy, but he would just buzz and it hurt. I have a picture when I was like 5 or 6 next to my sons, and our hairstyles are almost identical, oddly enough, but mine was kind of off to the side and shaved up, and it hurt. And Tal would always put the staining stuff, on boys, on the back of our heads, and it burned a lot. But my dad always took me to Tal. And then we'd go to Bill's Barber Shop, a couple of days that were up here, and son Leo's the one. But Tal was kind of the one that if you were downtown, you'd get a cut from Tal.
So the freeway came in. There were homes there. Yeah,
Oh,
nice
yeah.
homes.
Oh, there were some of the nicest homes in this part of Redlands. Remember, this was before Canyon Crest had been turned into homes that are now Smiley Heights. This was before the houses on the south side around Palo Alto and outer Sunset Drive were built. So these were some of the nicest homes. It was the homes of professors, doctors, of lawyers, and of working class families that could afford to buy these nice
on
homes.
the north side,
On the north side,
where the freeway is now.
right where the freeway is.
Okay, and what happened?
Well, in the 1950s, there was nationally, there was a move to create an interstate highway system, and cities lobbied ferociously for the right to have the freeway pass through town. The landowners were going to win big. And oftentimes, in small communities like Redlands, the landowners happened to be the guys that ran the Chamber of Commerce, the local newspaper, the groves, all these things. And so those were very common interests. There was kind of an informal referendum taken at one point when they showed the routes of the freeway. There were 5 routes initially. They narrowed it down to 3. They did this referendum. And according to a EULA professor I interviewed years ago, is that 90% of the people in town voted for the freeway not to go to the center of town.
Really?
And they were ignored by the city council and the Chamber of Commerce, who continued to lobby for what they called the central route. One of the routes would have gone along Brookside. Another one would have gone along the Wash. The third route would have gone out the canyon through where the Highway 60 is now. And
Around San Timoteo Canyon, you're saying? Okay.
And it would have essentially, well, it wouldn't have avoided Redlands. It would have made commerce in Redlands, it kind of would have made Redlands into, continue to be an agricultural, quiet community, which is what most of the people wanted. But the commerce and the people that own the land did not want it that way. And so that's, because it really didn't destroy any businesses. And like in most communities, the freeways did go right through the heart of downtowns. In Redlands, it didn't. They took out houses. And because I think people were, it was not a time where people got organizing and things like that if it bothered them. It was more of a time, well, the states come, they're offering you money to buy your home, and you're going to move.
Okay, so they offered all these doctors and professors money, and they relocated to...
Many have moved to the south side.
The south side?
Because new housing tracts were being built. And as they built, the mobility was strictly for... Out here, people lived side by side, different ethnicities. But when they moved to the south side, they became different, what they call racial covenants in real estate, where you couldn't sell to black people, brown people, Jews, anything like that. You couldn't do it. And, scratching again, it was very common. And so what the freeway did serve, and oftentimes in the case of my Uncle Frank, whose family had a house in the freeway.
Frank what?
Frank Lopez.
Okay.
Uncle Frank's family, when they got money, they just up and moved out of town. And so according to some people I spoke to, when we did interviews for Living on the Dime, we had a hard time finding anybody that was displaced by the freeway directly because their families had all moved away for the most part.
Okay, I'm going to stop you. Living on the Dime. You're talking about a video documentary that you made, and the Dime refers to the 10 freeway.
10 freeway,
And you did a documentary about people who lived along the 10 freeway, including in Redlands, and how that's impacted their lives.
It was actually, it really started out as not a film documentary project, but a humanities project that was to gather material and information to see how communities had been affected by the 10 and how people's stories could help them keep their communities stable, improve their communities. But the idea, the genesis of that idea was here. It was here in Redlands. And this is a statewide thing that we got quite a bit of funding for to do. And we have thousands of photos and hundreds of hours of video, but it really started here along the 10. Because when I was a kid, that was my main point of reference. It was finished the year I was born, 1964. I lived a block away from it. The freeway put me to sleep at night, the sound of it. We played on it, around it when we were kids. So that freeway, to me, was the biggest landmark that I interacted with in the community. But I realized, as I started doing the original Redlands Oral History Project, And it wasn't even because people complained so much about it. It was the absence. Yeah, so-and-so used to live there. Oh, yeah, I remember when you used to be able to stand there and see across the whole town. It wasn't even like, oh, that darn freeway. But I realized that we had lost something. That I had never, my family had been here since 1900.
Uh-huh.
And as a Mexican-American in Redlands who grew up here, and as a historian, it was almost embarrassing that I didn't know this stuff. And so I started to think, if it happened, what happened here? If it happened in Redlands, where did it happen? It happened everywhere else. And that's when we started to look into it. And so really, the work that I did in Redlands in the 90s has pretty much transitioned into the larger work. Because Redlands has a tremendous amount of just historical resources that you can use to do that kind of research.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's...
And you have subsequently published a book. I know that it came out on August 16th. It was dedicated, and I know because I introduced it, and it was my birthday, so I will remember that.
Mexican Americans in Redlands, that's right.
Yes, and it has the photos, and it has some of the stories.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine there's a lot more to tell than can fit in one book.
Oh, yeah.
But
tremendous amount of material.
the thrust of it is that Mexicans, for a long part of our history, were not treated as equal citizens of this community. We're kind of going north in this interview down the freeway or down Orange Street. So go under the freeway now. We're at the corner where I think of it as Wynn's Drugstore, but originally it was the Wyatt Opera House.
You bet.
I shouldn't say originally. Before it was Wynn's, it was the Wyatt Opera House. Talk to me about the Mexican representation at this cultural center of Redlands. Before Redlands was divided, right? Because the society, people to know, were there. That's where the Casa Loma Hotel was across the street, and Wynn's Opera, or the Wyatt Opera House, and the community was not so divided north and south at the time, or Mexican and white, or the haves and the have-nots.
No, it definitely. See, I think because from the founding of Redlands, and Redlands was a couple of different communities. There was Ligonia, which is where that area that you're referring to was the edge of Ligonia in the beginning of Redlands. There was Redlands proper, which is downtown, and the Chicago Colony and some of the other areas.
And as long as you're saying that, let me jump in and then say to the west, it was a town called Teresina, and to the east it was Crafton. So all of this became Redlands, but we were, as you're saying, we had different names for the different parts that were different.
Yeah, different communities, you
Okay.
bet. And so the Ligonia area, which was essentially from Colton Avenue down to Ligonia Street, San Bernardino Avenue, that area, it was a very busy community, and it did have, remember the Fox Theater wasn't built till the 1920s, and the Wyatt Opera House actually burned down in the 1920s. And so at that point, because the Casa Loma Hotel was there, this grand hotel that presidents visited, it really was a social center of life. The university was down the street from it. There were these beautiful homes in the terrace, and all these, so there was a big supportive community. And the Wyatt was, it was notable because although facilities in Redlands like that were segregated, many of them did have days when the Mexican community could come. And Sundays was a day where the Mexican Philharmonic Orchestra, it's amazing, I have a picture of like 60-piece orchestra, made up of locals. They all bought their own instruments, and a local patriotic club that my grandfather and great-grandfather were members of, I believe it was called the Alianza Hispano-Americano, were one of the groups that would help pay for lessons and uniforms. There's a neat story attached to it about how how that came to be and how we pieced it together. Connie McFarland, a longtime resident of the community, her grandfather, Epimenio Guzman, played sax in the band. And when I interviewed Connie, she gave me a picture. This is my grandfather. All I know is he used to play at the Wyatt Opera House. And then we published the picture in the Facts. And I got a phone call from a gentleman out in Sun City. He says, I know the man in the middle of that picture. That's my grandfather. So we got to see him, and we find out that this man had created philharmonic orchestras. He was a professor of music in Mexico during the Revolution. Came to the United States, and like many people, a lot of people assume that Mexican immigrants that came, we start out at the lowest level where we're pickers of things and cleaners of things. But you got to remember that just like in any other country, people have different reasons and to different socioeconomic levels of income. And a lot of the people had left behind their culture and their education in Mexico, but they didn't want to leave it behind completely. And so they got this orchestra together. They funded this. They funded a boys' marching band. They funded a drum and bugle corps. You know, there were two very active churches, St. Mary's and Divine Savior, that were important to the community. And so, having that area, I know I drifted a little bit, but having that area around the Wyatt Opera House and that area first as a social center, and then later on as a commercial center that kept the neighborhood intact. I mean, Wynn's is still big in my memory.
Yeah.
I literally, as a kid, I had the run of Wynn's. I could go in the back room and hang out with Tom Wynn as he made up prescriptions, and you can't do that kid anymore, and I'd go back and watch you guys flip burgers. That was like my backyard. Stater Brothers, I helped the guys load the greengrocer stuff. Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, my first job was at a pizza parlor down the street, delivering papers, working at Sam Wert's gas station. All these and all the buildings are still there. Mm-hmm. That's the cool thing.
I'm backing you up again.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, the Wyatt Opera House. Mm-hmm. You said it was segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So my great-grandmother, couldn't have gone on a Wednesday night to see a performance at the Wyatt Opera House. They had to wait until Sundays? Okay, but the Mexican Philharmonic could perform there. Okay. Casa Loma Hotel, have you got anything?
Yeah, apart from the really great history that the library has, it was a center of activity for major holidays. We have this neat picture of Richie Richardson. Mm-hmm. He owned Richie's Garage down on Central, near where Sizzler is now. And Rita Radliff, his daughter, and Lee Richardson, his son, gave an amazing history of their family. Because their father was white, he was a chauffeur, they lived up on Crescent. And they had a little community of Mexican people and Portuguese people who lived up there. And the Richardsons provided these amazing photos of Richie. He was a race car driver. He built his own race cars. And there's a photo of him in one of the race cars before a big race on the 4th of July in front of the Casa Loma. And Lee says, yeah, that place was always just a busy place. Always neat things happening there, great, exciting events. And him as a child, he was born in 1913. He's like, as a child, that was for me, that area was, kind of the center of town. Uh-huh. Even though downtown was, his dad had a business there by the 30s, but really as a child, that was a real big part in his memory.
All right, and you mentioned the library. We used to have a library on the north side. It was an offshoot of Smiley, and it was, I want to say, in the Presbyterian Church?
Sure was.
What happened there?
Well, it was called the Mini Branch, and the Mini Branch was, for me and a generation of kids my age, that place really, was responsible, I think, for a tremendous amount of really bright kids coming out of our neighborhood because we had our own library. Mm-hmm. It was there only for a few years, but man, I was always there. Kids in the neighborhood always there. But it was one little room. It was a little tiny room stuffed with books. In 1978, Proposition 13 came, and as cost-cutting measure.
78?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe it was 78.
Okay.
It's been a long time.
I have 82 in my head, but I might be wrong. Okay.
It was 78 because I was going to Moore Junior High. Uh-huh. I was 13 years old, and a couple of kids and I formed a protest group about it.
Did you really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we went and spoke to different women's groups and stuff because we were like, we knew what was going to happen. My mom was a teacher, and we knew what was going to happen to our schools.
Where was your mother a teacher?
At that time, she was just finishing her degree, and she taught in San Bernardino.
Okay.
Yeah, she was an elementary school teacher in San Bernardino. And so we knew it was just going to cause a lot of problems, and it did. We lost towels in the gym first, and our lockers, and all these things became tighter and tighter. And that was one of the things that directly affected the library, and they tightened their belt. And I think it shut a couple of years after that passed, but it was it was as a direct result of that.
You pointed out in the tour that you gave me that you cross the freeway and you leave behind the murals of the oranges and the services that are available, and you have now check cashing centers, tattoo parlors, liquor stores. I mean, it's an obvious change.
It's an obvious change.
when you cross over to the north side, and you don't see libraries, you don't see any kind of postal service, you don't see pharmacies, some of the things that you were pointing out that serve the community. You want to talk a little bit about them and wax political for a moment here?
Well, you know, that is something that, you know, it is a tragedy that has happened to many, and they call them, you know, poor areas, working class, low, whatever you want to call it. It's areas where people who most need the kind of community services, oftentimes elders, they need services like that, have lost them. Essentially, they've lost them to higher priced neighborhoods. They've lost them to new tracts, new subdivisions that demand their own shopping centers and all the perks so that they can drive their car a block to go. Mm-hmm. And in a community that's mostly mobile, on foot, North Redlands is very much that way. The streets are still very small and narrow. Up until a few years ago, they were dirt in my neighborhood. Right before I moved, they paved them just recently, actually, right down Sun Avenue. But people use those streets and use those services. And so when you mention Wynn's, yeah, that same thing. When I was growing up, we have a picture of it. There was Wynn's, there was a hardware store, there was a dry cleaner, there was Bank of California where my mom and dad had their mortgage. Those are the services that were right in that block. Important, necessary services. There was a Five and Dime across the street, there was a hair salon, there was a liquor store, all these things. And what I think we've seen is that this rush for these services that, hate to say it, tend to prey on people that don't have a income or good credit, like check cashing places. They're notorious for doing that kind of stuff. That's why they set up there. I still don't understand why we have no post boxes in most of North Redlands, because, you know, people say, well, you don't have them anywhere in town. Okay, well, here's a post office in central Redlands. There's postal annexes in some of the places in Redlands. Now, I have to give a lot of credit to folks that, like Uncle Howie, stuck it out for how many years in that Livonia Plaza as it fell apart until finally someone saw the wisdom of recreating it. But what's the anchor? County-based social services, which are at the whims of the economy. That thing goes, you lose a major anchor to that center. And what do those people do after that? The grocery store is great. And what, they have a Walgreens there now?
They do.
There's a Walgreens there. And so those things were important. But why are they there? Because they recently added large subdivisions to that part of town. And the folks that live there, what's amazing is university students don't even know that they can get fresh tortillas down the street. Have no clue.
Oh my gosh.
That literally behind them there's this little neighborhood that they can do all the shopping and just a nice, comfortable little ethnic neighborhood, cheap food, you know, and it's right there. And every time I talk to U of R students, I used to do bus tours. I take them by there and like, we didn't know this is here.
Oh, and their beans and their salsa.
Backyard.
It's bright, yes.
And that's, you know, and that's because they tend to push them out into the services that are in town or out of town. And so there's always been a strong small business drive in North Redlands. My grandmother ran 5 restaurants in her life. My Uncle Eddie ran liquor stores. My great Uncle Jesus ran businesses. And so all this was possible in this community in spite of the difficulties, you know, racial or whatever, economic. People still did that here. And I think you see that tradition continuing in North Redlands. You don't see, and you know, a while back there was a big fight over redevelopment, and I'm proud to say I was part of that fight because I realized that, you know, they were going to fill the donut hole with big shopping center one way or another. That land was for that reason. It was supposed to be developed. That's why the guys bought it 50, 75 years ago. That was their stated intention, was at some point, this is for our children, that land's going to be sold and it's going to be built in commercial buildings. It was called the Tri-City Project. So those that weep and cry about the loss of the orange groves, at least we still have most of North Redlands intact because, well, we were just too poor to trample over. But at the point that it became feasible 5, 10 years ago, people had to stand up and fight, and they did. I'm really proud to be a part of the organization that formed almost overnight of elders and young folks that had moved into the neighborhood to tell the city no.
What's the name of your?
Well, it was. I don't think it's together anymore. It was called the Livonia Community Association.
Okay.
And we literally formed it overnight. A couple of folks, elders that knew me, called me up and said, "Hey, they're talking about redeveloping our neighborhood. That's my house. What can we do?" And I said, "Well, I just happen to know a little bit about that." And we came in and started to organize people. And really, the history work that I've done since it's not in a I teach history to people. I try to teach people to use history to know their community better, to know themselves better, and to understand that history gives you power. And that is a power to determine your future. That's something very important in my work.
Okay, so then let's talk a little bit more about the segregation that used to exist in Redlands in terms of community services. How about public swimming?
Okay.
Talk to me about
Well, sure. You know, as we know, there were segregated places in all the communities. Southern California was notorious for its rigidly enforced segregation. People like to comment about the South and how backward the South was, and how they had Klan and all this stuff. The modern Klan started in Pomona, Fontana. You know, a lot of people don't know that. But the Klan in the 1920s sprang up here.
In Redlands?
You know,
and in Pomona?
Yeah,
okay.
Pomona, Fontana, in that whole area. But you used to see signs in Redlands that would say TWK, Trade with Klan. Didn't say that, it was just TWK.
I understand there was a strong Klan presence in Redlands.
There was a strong Klan presence. Now we never found pictures of their parades like you can find in Pomona, but there was a strong Klan presence. There was a strong, and it wasn't. There were other natives groups besides the Klan that had nicer, names, but they were still very much, we are for enforcing these strict social codes, or segregation, and whether. It became kind of, it wasn't even racially based anymore. It was just, because the idea of saying, well, you're a little lighter skinned, so you're acceptable, even though you have a brown name. That happened a lot out here. And so I think it was just, as a class of people, the people that worked hard, the people that worked to make the money, the people that had the money, as someone used to tell me, were the ones that suffered the most in Redlands. It's pretty typical, it's not uncommon. But what we saw with this redevelopment thing was this whole thrust for people to say, we have homes, we have a life here, we've given to our town. Now leave us alone, and that's really all. We can. I think that the pool, which is the Sylvan Plunge, segregated pool, and again, people tell me stories of how Tuesday was the day that you could swim. Now it used to be
if you were Mexican.
If you're Mexican. And people would tell me, that was the day they drained the pool. And I talked to some pool cleaners over the years. It's physically impossible to drain a pool like that just to clean it. What they probably did was just, they cleaned it out really well.
They emptied it into the Sankey, I heard.
So, well, see, and again, these are various rumors that I've tried to check out over the years. And several people have told me, they said no, they didn't actually empty the pool. They just cleaned it out. That was the cleaning day. Because that really got people mad. The entire pool, and it doesn't make any sense to empty the pool. It makes no sense whatsoever when you can just clean it. Okay,
so the Mexicans were allowed to come the day of the week that
the pool was going to be cleaned.
It was going to be cleaned.
Yes.
Okay.
Just Tuesday.
But they had the floral plunge.
They had the floral plunge, the Mexican plunge, which was just down the street, and that was built by the House of Neighborly Service, where we sit, which is an important landmark to mention. We do the two of them. The House of Neighborly Service was created by the Presbyterian Church, and my family's church, which was Divine Savior, is a Presbyterian church. I say my family because my great-grandfather founded the church. He's one of the founding members. Him and 12 families came from Mexico to settle in here now and to create this church. Now we know that the Martinez family, Odi Martinez's family, actually was here before that. And so we think that it was the Martinez family that wrote back somewhere, probably some letter exists somewhere, telling these families to come because they knew my family in Mexico.
This is a great thing to bring up because I think a lot of people assume that all Mexicans are Catholic.
That's right.
But there's a strong Presbyterian
a very strong string of Presbyterianism.
Population.
And Redlands, and this is one of the things that actually got me started in the research to begin with. At the Heritage Room, they have this huge file on the churches of Redlands. Redlands at one time had more churches per resident than any other city in the country. Huge presence. Yeah, so even like New York City. It's got
really?
Yeah. For percentage of population, there are more churches. And they have a big file on the churches. And so as I was doing my research, I was digging through the file. Not one mention was made of my family's church.
Really?
Not one.
Aren't they celebrating a major milestone?
100 years this year.
Okay.
There was no mention of it. They had been in existence at that point something like 70, 75 years. They were the first Spanish-speaking church in all of San Bernardino County. They were the first church built by the Mexican residents for a Spanish-speaking population. They were a church that was deeply concerned about social welfare, although they were very conservative. Part of the Presbyterian creed was dealt with social welfare, and making sure that people in the community had access to educational opportunities, cultural opportunities. And so the House of Neighborly Service was built, this building we're in, this plaque over there, and this is the original fireplace, by my great-grandfather and a number of other men in the community and women put this place together.
And we're running out of time, but I really want to talk about what the House of Neighborly Services did and what its impact was on this community.
Okay.
So,
it was a private community center. They held, it was both for the local residents of the Colonia who would come for anything from homework assistance to, they would teach girls homemaking skills. They had a big baseball field in the back where the boys played ball. They had, and they, even now today, they have showers. They have laundry facilities, because remember, a lot of the Mexican migrants in Citrus, they lived in shacks right along the tracks out here. My dad used to live in little shotgun shacks, wooden shacks, but they didn't have plumbing, or if they did, it was, you know, not very good. So they'd come over here. I mean, Blasco also told me it cost like a nickel to take a shower. But everybody.
you said that very quickly. Vazquez, you said, told you this.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And all the elders that I spoke with, even down to my older brothers and sisters who experienced this place when it was in its full, have the most amazing memories of it, because it wasn't, Catholics and Presbyterians weren't supposed to mingle, and the parish priests were very, very down on, as a matter of fact, one of Odie's best friends couldn't come to his wedding because he was Catholic and would not go into the church.
Wow.
And so that was something that weighed really heavily on people, but everybody could come here.
Yeah, I think I sent you a photograph of Odie. He might have been 5 or 6 years old with my grandmother. They were dancing.
I want that.
I'll send it to you
So,
if I didn't already.
but everyone could come here and partake in the things they offered. And one of the most amazing things, and I'm hoping to restage this, was El Aguila. They put together a play. It was like the Ramona pageant. My grandfather and all these folks were in it. Huge pageant play back here in the courtyard. And we have amazing pictures of it that have dancers and singers, and it was a musical that was supposed to be an ongoing pageant and lasted for a few years. And I'm hoping, I'm working on a play that will put elements of El Aguila into the play and restage some of the scenes.
And I think some of those photos have my Aunt Martha and
That's
my
right.
Uncle Phil in
That's
them,
right.
Romero.
That's right.
So, yeah.
And so it's amazing that this place was really a center of so much in the community, but has been, even its own history has been lost in the community, how important this place is. But yet it still serves an amazing function in its new incarnation.
As family services.
As family services. It has never lost its ability. I remember reading minutes after the freeway was built. The board was terrified. You could tell. It was panic.
The freeway runs right
Literally
here.
in their backyard.
Yeah.
And they were just terrified. What is it going to do? How can we possibly serve the community that we were intended to serve? The answer was they couldn't. They had to refashion who they were, and the House of Neighborly Services still exists. This is one of the ones that didn't make it because of the freeway. The one in Riverside in Casaloma still exists, and there's one in Tucson still exists. But what this place gave to the community, again, I think has never been stated enough. And what the history of the Mexican community in Redlands, one book does not make up for the loss of 125 years of neglect.
Well, I hope you have more books in you.
I hope I do too.
Okay. And you brought a copy of your documentary,
Right.
Living on the Dime.
Living on the Dime. This is our new film, and we're putting out a series of these, as well as 99 Before the Dime, which is about Highway 99, and a film called 21st Century Boomtown, which looks at the Segregation past and modern days, how the freeway has affected those communities out there.
Thank you so much for coming and talking with us this morning. What you're doing is so important, I think, to keep the history of Redlands alive. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I hope that people take the time to, certainly within their own families, learn the history, learn their stories, and pass them on to the community.
Amen.